Proceedings now underway in former President Donald Trump's business fraud criminal trial. It provided a clear roadmap of how prosecutors will try to make the case that Donald Trump broke the law and how the defense plans to fight those charges. Joining me on the morning show, political analyst Daniel Cronrath. Hey, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Bruce, thanks for having me.
So, dueling narratives from the lawyers. The prosecution painted this as election fraud and the defense as a bookkeeping case. They said it was that simple. What resonated most in the opening statements with you?
I think, the approach of the prosecution was very, very thorough. They were very even-keeled in the way that they laid out the evidence of the crime. Whenever you begin a trial like this, again, not a practicing attorney, but if you look at famous political trials, the first thing that the prosecutor wants to do is lay out a story. What is the story of the crime from the beginning and to the end? And that's really what the prosecution did. They said that they were going to be creating a step by step by step, which at the end of that would be clear to any of those 12 jurors that there was criminality that took place. The defense, on the other hand, they are going to try to appeal to emotion. They're going to try to appeal to the fact that this is a president of the United States, that this is a crime which occurs, colloquially a lot, which is not prosecuted, trying to paint Trump really as just being a political victim. You'll probably see as it goes forward a lot of ad hominem attacks, particularly in conservative media, to try to cast doubt on the reputation of the judge, as we've already seen. The prosecutor, of course, and the fact that, living in Manhattan, that both of them have been affiliated with the Democratic Party. And then, also, I think we're going to see a lot of emotional appeals to the jurors themselves. Again, in a jury trial such as this, you only need one or two people, if you're the president's defense team, to basically cast doubt in their minds about the validity of these charges and whether or not, in fact, former President Trump is being politically targeted.
Right, so Prosecutor Matthew Colangelo, in opening statements, called this a planned, coordinated, long-running conspiracy to influence the 2016 election. It was election fraud, pure and simple, he said. Do you think that this characterization was designed to combat suggestions by some pundits that this case isn't as serious as the other three cases he faces?
I think so, and I think that they don't want to dismiss, and the prosecutor wants everyone to be aware of the fact, while this may not seem like things which are earth-shattering, and this may seem as if, one of the things President Trump, for example, is going to argue his defense team, that this had nothing to do with trying to alter the outcome of the election. This was just to save President Trump and his family pain from having a lot of these things being disclosed publicly. However, I think what the prosecutor is going to do, also with the first day testimony of Mr. Pecker, of course, who was the 20-year president of the National Enquirer, yeah. Right, is going to be to say that, hey, these catch and release scheme, basically where we're going to go out, we're going to take a story, we're going to buy it, we're going to bury it so that it doesn't shame the president. They pay off to Ms. Stormy Daniels through Donald Trump's former attorney, Mark Cohen, that these things speak to a greater narrative, that Donald Trump was actively trying to suppress this information and do these things in a way which was going to tip the balance of the election to himself. Again, the president's team is going to argue, one, the president has steadfastly said he never had an affair with Stormy Daniels, but two, they're going to add again that this is about personal embarrassment, not about politics, not trying to engineer the outcome of an election.
So let's talk about the defense characterization here. Trump's defense attorney, Todd Bleich, on the other hand, attacked the case as baseless, saying the former president did nothing illegal. He said Trump agreed to pay Stormy Daniels to aid his campaign and protect his family, his reputation, and his brand. And he said the very point of a campaign is to influence an election. He told jurors it's called democracy. They put something sinister on this idea as if it's a crime. The defense also addressed former Trump attorney Michael Cohen. His credibility is really in the spotlight here in this case.
Oh, for sure. We know for a fact that Mr. Cohen has already served jail time, that he perjured himself in previous testimony. And now, as a key prosecution witness, he's going to be called, and his veracity is going to be something that the defense will undoubtedly attack. We know, Mr. Cohen, that you've already lied previously. Why are you not lying to this court today simply because you had a falling out with your former employer, Mr. Trump? And that's certainly the way that the defense is going to paint it. But there's going to be other individuals who are going to feature in this trial as well. Former White House staffer Hope Hicks is going to be set to testify. Stormy Daniels herself will testify. And then ultimately, Bruce, at the very end of the day, and while this seems most unlikely from most criminal attorneys that I've been listening to, will be whether or not Donald Trump himself will take the stand in this trial.
A lot of people said that it would not be in the best interest of Mr. Trump to take the stand. So it was also interesting to note the way the two sides referred to Donald Trump, who, by the way, said very quietly, listening to opening statements. Prosecution referred to him as a defendant. The defense took a different tack, saying, we will call him President Trump out of respect for the office he held. No doubt a calculated and deliberate move by both attorneys designed to send a message to the jurors.
That's right. I think it's just reiterating the fact that these 12 jurors jurors are in an extraordinary position. They're going to be receiving a lot of coverage, a lot of things that they don't want after this trial. And from all accounts inside the courtroom, this is a very, very modest courtroom. It's been called by some analysts a DMV with a large ceiling. So I think that reminding folks of that jury that you are here with a former president of the United States, do you find these charges serious enough? The other thing I think that we're going to heard mention, which is fair to say, if President Trump is actually convicted, if this jury of 12 people actually convict him, would the president see jail time? Most people, including myself, would say no. Not necessarily just because he's a former president of the United States, but I think it's going to be asked is, we've already criminally convicted President Trump. What does it serve the American people to incarcerate a 77-year-old man who could easily serve his sentence from house arrest? It's also important to note, Bruce, that in that sentencing, this judge has a lot of latitude in terms of prosecuting to the maximum crime, which would be jail time for each one of these counts, or simply giving President Trump a slap on the wrist.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see, too, how the judge characterizes his gag order and how he treats him and what kind of sentence, if you will, he gives him when it comes to the gag order. Will it be a slap on the wrist? Will it be a fine? Will it be jail time? If he finds that he did violate the gag order, which the prosecution alleges he did, some 10 times.
Right.
That hearing is coming up at 9:30. We'll be talking more about that.
Right.
Daniel, always a pleasure to have you here. Appreciate it.
Bruce, thank you.